Something about a man's voice can betray everything he has ever survived, and not the tone or the range or the technical precision either, but something that lives underneath the melody and reaches outward like a hand extended in the dark. Guy Penrod carries that kind of voice. For decades, people sat in church pews, in living rooms, in hospital waiting rooms, with his gospel music playing softly, and something in how he delivered each line made them feel they weren't alone in whatever they were carrying. They couldn't always name what that feeling was. What they knew was simpler and more direct than any explanation. When Guy sang, the song arrived already having been through fire. That feeling had a source. And for a very long time, Guy kept that source entirely to himself. Gospel music built his name, and the Gaither Vocal Band gave him the platform that made his voice a household presence across the Christian music world. Audiences responded to his long silver hair, his unhurried stage presence, and a voice that somehow held sorrow and warmth at the exact same moment, without either one canceling the other out. He could hold a single note and make an entire room go still, and what happened in that stillness wasn't spectacle, it was recognition. The room didn't stop because something impressive was occurring. The room stopped because something true was, and that difference is everything when it comes to worship. Performers generate applause, witnesses generate silence, and then something deeper than silence that doesn't have a clean name. His solo career took what the Gaither years had established and drove it further into people's lives. Songs like Because He Lives and Knowing You'll Be There stopped being songs somewhere along the way and became instead the soundtrack to the hardest seasons ordinary people move through: Sunday mornings after devastating weeks, funerals where words failed, hospital rooms where all anyone could do was let the music sit with them. His voice was consistently there for those moments, and what it brought each time went beyond craft. Conviction lives in a voice the way water lives in wood, invisibly but completely, and you hear it whether you understand it or not. Fans picked up on this before they had any language for it. The way he closed his eyes at certain verses wasn't performance habit, and the slight pause before a lyric that cut deepest wasn't stage timing, it was something private surfacing briefly before he covered it again. People in those audiences often found themselves watching his face more than listening, because his expression told a story the melody alone couldn't carry completely. None of them knew the details of what that story was. What they knew was that this wasn't a man illustrating faith from a comfortable distance. This was a man reporting from inside it. That story began long before any stage or studio or crowd of thousands. It began in a family home, between a son who felt an unmistakable calling toward Christian music and a father who had built his understanding of love around security, stability, and keeping his family close to what he knew. Guy's certainty about music wasn't arrogance. Arrogance announces itself and demands attention, but Guy's calling was quieter and more persistent than that, the kind that doesn't retreat when practical arguments are made against it, and doesn't require anyone's permission to remain. His father wasn't a harsh man. He wasn't withholding love out of cruelty or indifference. He was a man who understood the world in a particular way, who watched his son lean toward something offering no guarantees, and who pushed back the way fathers sometimes do, when love doesn't yet know how to be generous enough to release. The disagreement held its ground and then widened, and from there it followed the path that unaddressed pain always follows. It hardened into silence. Not the silence of hatred, because neither man carried hatred for the other, but the silence of two people who both felt misunderstood, and neither found a way to cross back over the distance that had quietly accumulated between them. Birthdays passed without calls. Letters went unanswered. Holidays carried that specific hollowness that unreconciled families understand without needing to discuss it. The way a room full of people can feel emptier than an empty room when someone's absence is being carefully not acknowledged. And through all those years, Guy kept singing. He stood before thousands in the name of faith, and delivered songs about grace at the same time he was struggling to extend grace where it cost him the most. Worship services across the country heard his voice carry the message of forgiveness, while the relationship that most needed his forgiveness sat quiet and unresolved somewhere back in the distance. None of this was dishonesty. This is what genuine belief actually looks like when it's being lived rather than performed. The gap between what you hold as true and what you're presently managing to live, and the daily choice to keep walking toward the truth anyway. Trusting the gap will close. Guy believed in forgiveness completely. Living it, in the specific context of his father, remained a work in progress for years and years. What accumulated in that time wasn't only personal grief, though personal grief was certainly there. It was the specific weight that comes from choosing a calling over comfort, and waiting to discover whether the trade was worth what it cost. Success arrived, real and meaningful success. Concerts filled and albums carried his voice into homes he'd never see, and churches he'd never visit. And still the one quiet validation that sons carry as an unspoken hunger, that steady approval from the man who raised them, stayed just out of reach. He never addressed it from any stage. He carried it the way most people carry their deepest wounds, privately and wordlessly, visible only in the art that poured out each time he opened his mouth and gave himself completely to a song. His listeners didn't know the facts. What they felt was the weight those facts created, and you cannot manufacture that kind of weight. No vocal coach installs it, and no studio engineers it into a recording. The sound of a person who has genuinely wrestled with grace and personally needed it in their own life doesn't have a synthetic version, and audiences sense its absence immediately, even when they never consciously register its presence. When Guy sang about redemption, nobody in the room felt they were watching someone illustrate a theological concept. They felt they were watching someone give a report from lived experience, and that is the whole distance between a performer and a witness. Guy Penrod was always, at his core, a witness. At 61 he put that into words for the first time. No television special, no press release crafted by a publicity team, no social media announcement timed for maximum reach. True to the quietness that had always been part of who he was, Guy shared his story during a testimony at a church event, in a room full of people who had loved his music for years without knowing the full story underneath it. No cameras were positioned for emotional impact. No narrative was being managed. What existed in that room was simpler and more weighted than any of that. A man, an audience, and a truth that had waited long enough to be spoken. With words that visibly cost him something to deliver, he described his father. He described the years of silence, the accumulation of missed moments, the experience of standing on stages and singing songs of reconciliation while living inside an unreconciled relationship. The vulnerability he offered wasn't performed and wasn't managed. He simply gave it the way he had always given his music, without calculating how the room would receive it, without needing any particular response. Confession, when it's real, doesn't require an audience to react a certain way. It only requires honesty, and Guy had finally arrived at a place where honesty was the only thing left. And then he told them what happened after the silence broke. The beautiful part of his story is not the wound. Wounds are everywhere, and they're not beautiful, they're just the starting conditions of a longer story. And the wound only matters because of what was built from it. What gives Guy's testimony its lasting weight is the choice he made when he finally understood that time does not close wounds on its own. That forgiveness is not a feeling that arrives eventually if you wait patiently enough. That the only thing which genuinely rebuilds what silence has worn away is the willingness of one person to go first, to reach back without guarantees, to pick up the phone before knowing how the call will land. Guy made that choice, not in a single dramatic scene with the kind of resolution that movies prefer, but in the slow and unglamorous daily work that real reconciliation actually requires. Phone calls that started with awkwardness, letters that were finally answered instead of put away, conversations that rebuilt piece by piece what decades of silence had dismantled. None of it arrived as a clean emotional moment, wrapped in a satisfying conclusion. It arrived the way real healing arrives, incrementally and sometimes painfully, two people deciding together that the past could stay the past without pretending it hadn't happened. Forgiveness not as a warm arrival, but as a deliberate decision, made once and then made again until it finally held. When he described that process to the room, the silence that followed had the texture of recognition. Not sympathy for someone else's situation, but recognition, the specific quiet that falls when people understand that what they're hearing is their own story being told through someone else's life. Most people in that room carried some version of what Guy had carried, not necessarily with a father, maybe with a mother, a sibling, an old friendship that broke apart, a marriage that ended badly, a child who stopped returning calls. The specific relationship changes, but the underlying ache stays the same. The weight of things left unsaid, the years inside a silence that was never intended to last as long as it did, the stubborn question of whether it is already too late to find a way back. Guy's answer to that question was unambiguous. Not yet, not while both people are still alive. And even after one person is gone, the work of forgiveness still belongs to the one left carrying the wound, for no other reason than that it is the only way the wound actually closes. That answer is what separated his confession from the kind of revelation that generates attention for a week and then disappears. No scandal surfacing, no shameful past dragged into light, no carefully timed disclosure designed to sell something, just an ordinary human wound, the kind that most adults either carry themselves or have watched someone they love carry, brought into the open without drama or calculation, and in that simplicity, everything his listeners thought they already knew about him rearranged itself into a shape that finally made complete sense. The songs made sense. Every lyric he ever delivered about grace was a lyric composed from inside the experience of needing it urgently and not having it yet. Every song about healing was written before the healing had come. Every moment of raw emotion in a live performance had a source that was never stage technique and was never stage technique, because it couldn't have been. It was a son singing his way toward a reconciliation that would take decades to complete, trusting that the singing itself was part of the movement toward it. His legacy in gospel music was already secure before he ever stood in that church and said any of this. The catalog of recordings, the years with the Gaither Vocal Band, the solo work that extended his reach further into Christian music communities around the world, the consistent reputation for pointing every performance back toward faith rather than toward himself. All of that had already placed him in the history of the genre. But legacy isn't only what gets accomplished while people are watching, it's what remains after the accomplishments are finished, and what Guy left behind in that testimony is something no chart position or award has the vocabulary to measure. Permission is what he left. Permission for the people who heard his story to stop managing their wounds from a safe distance. Permission to reach back toward the people they've been too exhausted or too hurt or too defended to reach back toward. Permission to understand that religion and faith do not require the absence of struggle, but rather the refusal to let struggle become the final answer. Permission to believe that the things that broke them aren't disqualifications from meaningful worship, but are precisely what make worship honest, what strip it of the performance quality that keeps it from reaching anyone, what give it the weight that makes a room go still. He also left behind evidence of something that many public figures in Christian music are reluctant to demonstrate. The strongest voices in any room are not the most polished or the most technically accomplished. They're the most honest. Honesty carries a frequency that training cannot install and technique cannot replicate, and it lives in Guy Penrod's recordings whether or not any listener ever knew its source. Now they know. And knowing it means that every song he has ever recorded carries the meaning it was always carrying. Openly now, with nothing left concealed, available to be felt completely. The lesson his life offers doesn't ask much from the people who receive it. It doesn't require a particular background in theology or any specific experience with church or Christian community. What it asks is simpler and harder than doctrine. Carry your wounds, because there is no way around them, but refuse to let them write the last line of your story. Let them become the material from which something honest is made. Let them make your worship real, your relationships less defended, and your grace something that was genuinely earned rather than simply asserted. Let them lead you eventually back toward the people you love, and toward the God who was present through every year of silence, even the years when nobody was acknowledging that presence at all. Guy Penrod, at 61, gave the world a version of himself it had always been sensing but never fully seeing. Every performance across every year had been pointing toward this moment, this admission, this quiet evidence that the grace he spent his life singing about was never abstract, never theoretical, never a subject he happened to understand and communicate with clarity. It was personal. It was lived. It was real. His voice carried it from the beginning, and now his audience finally understands why.